I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and I appreciate the fact that you came out. They asked me to come down. I live in the state of Iowa now, but they asked me to kind of give the kind of a national perspective or the situation under which this particular amendment is being proposed and kind of put it into the national context, and so that's what I'll attempt to do. After working growing up on a farm and working in the food system, working with farmers and people of rural communities all my life, I've eventually come to the conclusion that change in the American food system is no longer just an option. It is an absolute necessity. And the problem with amendments such as this, right to farm amendments, is it would prevent or make very difficult the changes that are going to be absolutely essential for the future of agriculture, future of the food system, and the future of humanity. That's what I call my truth. I call it my truth because it's what I believe to be true. I speak my truth with conviction because I know why I believe what I believe. And if your truth is different from mine, that's all right with me as long as you know why you believe what you believe. And in my opinion, just because some so-called expert said something or you read it somewhere is not a good enough reason to believe anything. I think you need to get the facts, listen to all the opinions, and then make up your mind for yourself so it's your truth. But if you're to understand my truth, you need to know a little bit about my story. I grew up on a small dairy farm down in southwest Missouri. I was lucky enough at that time to be able to go to the University of Missouri, where I've got bachelor's degrees, master's degree, and a PhD degree in agricultural economics. Between my bachelor's and master's work, I worked for 3 years with Wilson Meat Packing Company, located in Kansas City. I also worked in Detroit and Atlanta and various other places. But at that time, Wilson was the 4th largest meat packer in the country. After I got my PhD and I worked in at North Carolina State, Oklahoma State, University of Georgia, University of Missouri, I finished there over a 30-year period. And the first half of my academic career, I was a livestock marketing specialist. I was the one that tried to figure out what hog prices were going to be 6 months from now, or cattle prices, or where we were in the cycles and things of that nature. So I had the whole time within agriculture. And the latter half of my career, I worked more with people in rural communities. So that's kind of my background. Now, the first half of that 30-year academic career, I was a very traditional agricultural economist. I said that farming as a way of life was out of date, that farming had to be treated as a business. And if you wanted to have a family farm, you had to separate the family from the farm because you couldn't let the family matters get in the way of the farm as a business. And I told farmers they had to be prepared to either get big or get out of agriculture, because we had to make agriculture farming more efficient, which meant we had to specialize, standardize, consolidate into larger and larger operations. I taught that to people. That's what I told farmers because that's what I'd been taught. In the middle of my career, in the 1980s, what I still refer to as the farm financial crisis, I had to rethink all of that. Because at that particular time, as many of you will remember, for circumstances I won't go into, farmers were caught with huge debts at high interest rates, and we had foreclosures and bankruptcies that were regular fare on the network evening news, and suicides were far less than rare. And I was at the University of Georgia at that time. We had several people in Georgia commit suicide because they lost their farm. And it wasn't the poor managers, it wasn't the bad farmers, it was the farmers that we'd called the good farmers, the ones that had been doing what we so-called experts was telling them to do, that were losing their farms. The laggards were holding on. It wasn't good times, but they were in a situation where they hadn't borrowed so much money and they were holding on. And I said, look, there's something fundamentally wrong with this. I didn't get all this education to work all this time so I could drive farmers out of business. And as I looked more closely at that, I began to understand that what was wrong is that we had created an agricultural system so ever so often a lot of farmers had to fail. Because in order for some farms to get bigger, it meant that other farmers had to fail so that the bigger farmers could buy their land and expand their operation or get a larger share of the market. We had created a system of failure. I could see that this system that we were promoting for the sake of economic efficiency wasn't good for the farmers that were losing the farms and losing their families and losing their lives. But it wasn't good for people in rural communities that depended upon those families, not just to buy stuff on Main Street, but also to sit in the church pews and to be in the schools so they could keep the schools open and have enough people for local health care and sovereign volunteer fire departments. Our rural communities were withering and dying because there wasn't families there anymore. It takes people, not just production, to support rural communities. I only come to the realization later that that kind of farming wasn't good for the land, and I could look around and I could see the erosion, I could see the pollution of the streams with agricultural chemicals and biological waste, and the pollution of the air, the degradation, the destruction of the natural productivity that future generations will have to depend upon. There was something fundamentally wrong. I couldn't continue to support and promote that kind of agriculture. It was not sustainable. It wasn't ecologically sound. It wasn't socially responsible. It wasn't economically viable. At about that time, the sustainable agriculture movement began to emerge, and I was looking for somewhere else to go, and that's where I moved into, because that kind of agriculture, I've still concluded, is not sustainable, and regulations or laws like this constitutional amendment will virtually encode or enshrine that factory farm system of agriculture. That's the very foundation of the problems that I've talked about. It took me a little bit later to come to the conclusion that not only was it bad for the environment and rural communities and for farmers, it had absolutely failed in its most fundamental purpose, which was to provide food security for the nation. You see, the reason that I bought into this is that by making agriculture more efficient, we were going to bring down the cost of food, and we were going to make good, wholesome food affordable for everyone. We were going to do away with hunger. But it failed. It didn't do that. We have a larger percentage of hungry people in this country today than we had in the 1960s when all of this last round of industrialization started. More than 15% of the people in this country live in food-insecure homes, which means that they don't know that they'll have enough money to have food through the end of the month. Almost a quarter of our children in this country, the richest country in the world, live in homes where they're not sure that they're going to have enough to eat. They're still hungry. We didn't feed the hungry. The people are hungry because they're poor, and industrialization agriculture didn't do anything to alleviate poverty. If anything, it increased poverty in rural areas and caused that problem to be even worse. And in addition to that, those people that can afford to get enough to eat, particularly the low-income people, the food that they're getting is making them sick. We've got an epidemic of diabetes in this country and related obesity in the country and related diseases of diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease and a range of cancers that are associated with agricultural chemicals and various other inputs out of industrial food system. The food system's making people sick. We succeeded in cutting the percentage of consumer income in this country spent on food in half, but at the same time we doubled the percentage that we spend on health care. We're spending more than twice as much in this country on health care today as we spend on food, and I would argue that that's no accident. What we've done is we've turned our farms into factories without roofs. We've turned our feedlots and our fields into biological assembly lines. We're treating people and animals and plants as if they were inanimate mechanisms, dead systems that we can manipulate. They're not mechanisms. We're living, thinking, feeling human beings. We've created a system that's in conflict with our very nature, and it simply is not sustainable. Change is no longer just an option. It's an absolute necessity. What the right to farm amendments are about, and from a national perspective, this isn't the only place that this movement has been put forward. It's the only place I know of it's on the ballot. But if it passes here, it will be all across the Midwest. It will be in Iowa and in Illinois and Kansas and all across the country. And what this is all about, they want to enshrine this factory farm industrial system of agriculture because they know that there's growing public concerns about the overall integrity of the food system. You know, the agricultural establishment, the commodity organizations and Farm Bureau and USDA and State Departments of Agriculture, universities, agriculture universities, you know, they'll tell us that we've got the safest food supply in the whole world. But the reality is that recalls, massive recalls of food for salmonella and E. coli and other contaminations become almost routine. They hardly even report it on the major newscast anymore, but you can go on the web and you can get it up. Once in a while they report it when too many people get sick or get killed. We don't have a safe food supply. And probably one of the most important things is the test that they've done with the food that's contaminated in the supermarket, high percentages of it, roughly half of the contamination is with antibiotic-resistant bacteria, such as that in MRSA, which now kills more people in this country than AIDS does. There's a recent CDC, Community Disease Commission, come out with a recent report on antibiotic resistance, and they say clearly in one statement in there that scientists around the world have come to the firm conclusion that antibiotic resistance is a major problem, and it is in fact linked to animal agriculture. And they went on to say that antibiotics used in humans should not be used in animal agriculture except by prescription to cure a disease or to treat a disease under the treatment of a veterinarian. The science is there. The ag establishment used to call for good science. Now they're talking about propaganda rather than science because the science is mounting up against them. They talk about farmers being good stewards of the land, and many of them are, but many of them aren't. The EPA reports there's 35,000 miles of streams in 19 Midwestern states that have been polluted with agricultural chemicals and biological waste. And the people will come around to the ag establishment again and says, well, we're doing a better job of manure management and precision farming and all this kind of stuff than we did in the past when we had smaller family farms. But if that's the case, why have we had a threefold increase in the number of impaired streams in the state of Iowa since the year of 2000? What's happened through 2000? An explosion of CAFOs, an explosion of corn production for ethanol, high rates of production with high inputs to bring that about. That's what's changed. You know, we need to come to the realization that when you've got 2,500 hogs out here, you've got the equivalent in terms of biological waste of a city or a town of 7,500 people. You can't just take that stuff out and dump it in people's backyards without creating public health risk. If you've got even 200 cows, you've got as much waste as a city of 10,000 people. We need to put sophisticated waste treatment systems in these farming operations, either that or close them down. These are public health risks, and the evidence is growing. With respect to animal welfare, we're putting too many animals in too small spaces to have any sense of respect for the dignity of that living being, that sentient being that's out there. It's not to the people that manage them or bad operations, but there's just so many of them crowded together. I had an opportunity to visit Poland, and I had an opportunity to go out and visit the Majdanek concentration camp that turned into an extermination camp for the Jews during World War II in Poland. And when I went to that camp and I could see those barracks lined out, and what I saw were rows of chicken houses, rows of hog houses. That's what we've done. We've got our animals in concentration camps, and there is no such thing as a humane concentration camp. It's simply inconsistent with the humane treatment of animals. And again, the ag establishment will tell us, well, we got to put up with a few of these things for economic necessity. The legislative language talks about the importance of agriculture to the economy of Missouri as if we couldn't do without this industrial system of agriculture. But folks, we've had no decrease in retail food prices over the last 20 years of this industrialization of agriculture. The statistics are there. You can look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, comes out with them. Food prices have been increasing faster than the rate of inflation, averaging 2 to 4% increases a year when inflation is 1 or 2%. Food prices are one of the fastest things going up. Any benefit from the reduction in cost of production at the farm level is more than offset by larger margins of the food industry, the big corporations that increasingly control not only the production and distribution of the food, but also the production of food through comprehensive contracts of various kinds with farmers. The consumer's not benefiting from the industrialization of agriculture. Rural communities aren't benefiting from it. The benefits are being extracted from those rural communities. They're going into the investors' pockets somewhere in some other country or the wealthy 1% or wherever they're going, but the rural communities end up with greater cost, economic cost. And it's no surprise, over 30% of the farm value of our food products today is going into export. You talked about China. That's what they're increasing production for. We have large numbers of CAFOs going in Iowa today, and it's targeted to the Chinese market. We end up with the manure, we end up with the odor problems, we end up with the public health problems, and they get the pork. That's where it's headed. And the rest of it's going into ethanol. 40% of our corn crops going into ethanol. This isn't about keeping down food cost to consumers or benefits to people in this country. It's about lining the pockets of the corporate investors by producing fuel and producing food for export. What this is all about, they're trying to enshrine this whole concept of the factory farming industrial agriculture, because they know that there's growing concerns about CAFOs, there's growing concerns about genetic modification, the use of hormones and antibiotics, and they want to build a firewall to keep us from doing anything about those when the public consensus arises and say, no more, we're not going to have any more of this. It would be like if we passed this constitutional amendments across the country, it would be like if we gave a constitutional amendment to smoke back in the early 70s when I first went to North Carolina, which was a major tobacco producer, probably still is a major tobacco producer. And they said, of course there's people concerned about health risk with smoking, but there's no scientific proof to prove that. There's no scientific consensus against that. So we went on year after year, and the consensus began to grow. And then after a while, we saw that there were health risks associated with it. We started regulating tobacco companies, and the tobacco companies admitted that there were problems. And then we found out secondhand smoke was a problem, and now you don't smoke in public places. You still have a right to smoke, but you can't blow your smoke in somebody else's lungs. You can't make someone else sick in the process of you making money raising or processing tobacco. But if we have this right to farm amendment and we conclude we have a consensus that GMOs are not safe, that we don't want routine feeding of antibiotics, that we don't want all of the things that we don't want the CAFOs that are polluting rural environments and causing public health risks, then we won't be able to do anything about it. Won't be able to pass regulations. It will be unconstitutional to regulate these things that are not regulated today. They have the right to go on doing it if they want to, forever. And the big thing is we don't need industrial agriculture. There's a whole new food system that's emerging out here today, and I have, thankfully, spent most of my time out here with people that are on a more positive measure. They have a different vision for the future. You know, organic gets most of the attention about the new foods, and organic markets was growing at 20% per year during the 90s, early 2000s, doubling every 3 or 4 years, still growing at a rate of more than 10% per year, the fastest growing segment. Local foods has taken over organic as the most dynamic part of it. There's local food organizations everywhere. Mike's going to talk about some of those. They're bringing them into campuses. There's groups, there's at least 12 conferences across this country that'll draw over 1,000 people a year that are oriented toward this alternative agriculture. It's not just fruits and vegetables for organic and local markets, but it deals into livestock and free-range chickens and free-range hogs, pasture-based poultry, pastured hogs, grass-based dairy, grass-based beef, hormone antibiotic-free, pesticide-free, humanely raised. The retail surveys indicate that 1/3 of the American consumers are looking for something fundamentally different than they're finding in the supermarkets and franchise restaurants today, and they're willing to pay premium prices to get what they want. That's the new food system. That's the new vision for the future. There is a way of producing that you can produce plenty of food for people that are out here today, food that's produced that's safe and wholesome for them to eat, food that's produced in an environmentally friendly way, food that's produced in a humane way, and food that's produced in a way that's profitable for the farmers and supports viable rural communities. There's a better way to farm, a better way to produce food, and a better way of life and a better future for humanity. We don't want to stop the change that's necessary for the future. The most important thing, I said I've developed a list of my top 10 reasons for opposing constitutional right to farm amendments in general. The most important reason I put at number 1 is that constitutions were not intended to grant special privileges to any group, including farmers, that would deprive other people of their basic human rights. What we're doing with amendments such as this is you're depriving people, particularly of rural communities, but society in general, of their basic human rights of self-determination and self-defense. It's a generally accepted principle that when we have good reason to feel that our health and well-being is threatened, which I say the evidence is there to give good reason, if not totally proof, then we have a basic human right to be able to defend ourselves against that threat. This constitutional amendment, if passed and if enforced, would deny the right of citizens, as eaters, as residents of your communities, of their basic rights of self-determination and self-defense. That's why I oppose these amendments. Thank you.